This is the Creative Soulpreneur Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Demas. Let's go. Welcome back to the podcast. Beth's brow wrinkled on her forehead. She said, "Wait, Nick, you work with speakers?" I said, "Yeah, storytelling, performance coaching is my specialty." I'd been sitting at a beautifully manicured table at a charity event, picking with my fork at a horrible vegetarian plate. Why are they always so bad at these events? Moments prior, I'd been in my head. Who am I to be here? These are all high-powered people. I don't know what to contribute. I worked up the courage, took a deep breath, and turned to the person next to me and said, "That last speaker was quite good. She reminds me of a client of mine who was recently a speaker at a similar event. They took this technique I gave them and they rocked it." "I had no idea," Beth squealed. "Can I have your info? We have to talk. I want to speak more in my business." The best stories are likely hiding in plain sight. On today's episode, we're going to talk about practical techniques for finding and crafting stories from your daily life. First, every entrepreneur needs a story bank. That's a list of stage-worthy moments. A story bank is a collection of narratives, anecdotes, case studies that are organized and stored for your future. It can be accessed when needed for so many purposes, for all of your business messaging and communication, basically, and especially speaking in your business. So which of these stories, if you're creating a story bank, are stage-worthy? That might be a question you're asking. You might be thinking, I'm not sure what's stage-worthy. Let me say this, first and foremost. There are no bad stories. There's only bad storytelling. So we're going to start with that in mind, because there's types of everyday stories that you can choose to use. But every story that you use needs a teaching moment. It needs a golden nugget of wisdom. The best stories, and part of this is from our past, from our history, from the fact that we've been telling stories since the beginning of time. The best stories are parables. They are the ones that have this lasting and quality, and they become very memorable. When we learn something, and when we learn it with story, we not only remember what we learned, but we remember the story and remember who told it to us. So these stories can be about failure, about recovery, about small victories. They can even be super mundane moments, but have a deeper meaning. If you can make it more meaningful, it can be client interactions. It can be personal challenges that you've gone through. You might be thinking, my life isn't that interesting, Nick. I don't have anything. But I want you to really think about the fact that mundane are often better than the bigger stories. We haven't all been bankrupt, right? I don't know what that feels like or is even remotely like. But we can all relate to having a month where it's really tight on your bills. And so you go online and you're looking at your credit card bill and you're like, oh, that we can relate to, no matter who we are and at whatever income level we're at. You might also think, I can't remember the details of a story. I get that a lot. A lot of clients will tell me that. And I want to say this, specificity is important. You'll notice I talked about picking up my fork and eating with the plate, eating the vegetarian plate. That's important, but not every single detail. You don't need to remember them all. You do need to give specificity so people get a sense of the time, space, place, but not every detail needs to be exactly in your memory. Probably the biggest question I get is, okay, I've got these stories, but I don't know how to connect them to my business. I don't know how to make it relevant. The question I would say to you or ask of you is, what is in it for your audience? That's really the biggest question. What's in it for them? And then how do we make these stories better? I've said that there's no bad stories, only bad storytelling. How do we make them better? Stories need some sort of surprise. In a musical, when we were creating them, we talk about this. A mentor taught this to me, that each act of a musical needs a surprise moment, a moment where the audience gasps or is turned off, is upset, something that shocks the audience in a way. And that can be created by my second point, which is points of tension. You need conflict, both internal and external conflict. Notice I had a lot of internal conflict about speaking up at the event, right? In my story that I was telling you about. Personal transformation. There's got to be some sort of transformation in it. The transformation in the story that I shared at the top was that because I spoke my truth, because I turned to somebody that and went through something uncomfortable, they actually wanted to know more, which is really brings us to the next one, which is universal experiences. We've all felt that. What is most personal is most universal. That's a quote from psychologist Carl Rogers, but it's so true. And we talk about it a lot in storytelling. I think Martin Scorsese says it a lot, but it is really one of those things that I hold most truly dear. The more personal you are about it, the more universal it becomes. And stories also need emotional peaks and valleys, right? The peak and the valley of me being in the valley of despair, of sitting there, and the peak, the high of the person saying, "Hey, I'm really interested. Can I have your card?" Basically. So there's a process here that you can use to mine the stories. On the daily, there's some techniques that you can use. The first is the voice memo technique. If you're not one that wants to write, pull out your phone, hit the voice memo, and just talk. Talk. If you are somebody who loves to write, you can journal. Julia Cameron talks about morning pages. My friend Julia, I call them flow pages. Just sit and write and write and write and write and write and write. And it doesn't have to be the final draft, right? You really have to have a pretty shitty first draft before you get to a better draft of the story. A photo prompt method where you just take photos, and something about having these photos stimulates a story, or you can even create a story through photos. Another is end of the day reflection. Journaling at the end of the day. There's something about when you're about to go to sleep and you're in that relaxed state. And if you journal, some really great inspiration comes up. And then another technique is experience mapping, basically mapping out your experience from the very, very beginning of the first job you ever had, basically, all the schooling you've ever had, and really going back and looking at the lessons that you learned on the path to where you are today. Now, for some of us that are older, this can take a bit of time, but really, you've got a lot of wisdom there. And the more you dive in, the more you realize how much wisdom you actually have, the lessons that you've learned. So you want a system for these stories, a way to process them. You got to have some sort of digital organization. You may want to categorize or tag them. You may want to put some context notes around them. I put them into some categories. That's sort of how I look at it. I've got personal growth and life lessons, which, is like my daily routine that sort of illuminates some sort of deeper meaning. My connection to myself and others. In Instagram story, I do a lot of baking, and people reach out to me for recipes. That's a story, right? The story of baking, the transformation of that. And people reach out to me for recipes, and it begins a conversation with people. Then I have them in personal development and failures. That's another category for me. A personal challenge that become some sort of teaching tool. One of my biggest failure stories that I talk about a lot is when my app failed. So public. I had an app that was supposed to come out, the Demas Word of the Day app. It was downright humiliating, to be honest. But what it taught me was a deep need for contracts. So I share that story in a much bigger, broader way than I just did here. I'm just giving you an example. I share that quite a bit. It's a failure story. Then there's another one category that I use called relationship insights, which is money and love. I tell a story about being a paper boy quite a bit and what it taught me about hard work. And then business experiences is another. I often speak of me speaking, stories of me speaking since I work with speakers, stories of me storytelling about my documentaries, about the musicals that I've worked on, about the Tony Awards. You probably heard that one, a timer 100. And that's not a bad thing either, the time or 100. You begin to get known for stories that you repeat. So it's not only is it okay to repeat stories, it's absolutely important to repeat stories. And then the other category for me of my 5, and I suggest 5 or so, is creative process. And a lot of that is before and after, which is also related to business, but this is more of, I'm working on this particular project and here's where we started and here's where we are now. I'm working with this client and here's where they started and here's where they are now. Real creative process transformation type stories. So you know what they are. You know you got to categorize them. And when you're developing them, there's layers of that. And I'm going to do an entire podcast episode about this, but I'm just going to very briefly talk about it today, which is there's a surface level of like what actually happened. Then there's the emotional level of what did you feel? There's the learning level of what did you realize? And then the universal level of why it matters. I keep going back to these layers, and because they are so important that all the layers appear in all of your stories. It's like the sensory details, the dialogue, the monologue, the inner monologue, the development, the character building, the timing, the pacing, the key phrases, the emotional transitions, the audience connection points. These are all so important to the development of your stories and the application of them. So where do you use these stories that you've created, that you've keep working on to get better and better in the many multi-layers? Business context. You got to integrate them into your business, not only on your speaking engagements, but in your marketing content, in your sales conversations, when you're teaching in workshops, webinars, on podcasts, when you're being interviewed. Anytime you're building your brand, you want to use stories. And then how do you adapt them? Because different audiences have different needs. It goes back to what does this audience need? Additionally, there's some time constraints. I can make any story 3 minutes, 30 minutes, or 3 hours. It really is adding and subtracting details. And then, of course, the platform that you're on. An Instagram story, no pun intended, is different than that's on LinkedIn or that is on a podcast platform like this. There's a constraint there. There's a time thing again there, but it also one is visual storytelling, one is auditory storytelling. These are very different types of storytelling, and you may also want to look at cultural considerations as well when you're depending on the audience that you're in front of. And it all goes back to alignment with your business and purpose. Why are you telling this story? Why right now? And speaking of why right now, you want this story bank right now. Yeah, you do. So that's your call to action from this episode is to go create a story bank. If you have any questions about it, feel free to DM me at the Nick Demas, and I'm happy to answer them there. And I can't stress enough the importance of using these stories in all of your communication in your business. And if you want to continue with some story selling, I should say, grab my latest guide, which is all about that, all about using story to sell your products, services, etc. You can get that at www.storytellingtomakesales.com. It's our story selling guide. Thank you so much. Go create that story bank. Mine it for all it's worth. I'll see you on the next episode.